No,
If
no,
I am,
you're on time. Absolutely.
if I am, I apologize. I got held up in the office. First of all, a very good evening, uh, members and your guests, and I thank you all for joining us on this virtual talk today. Uh, Before I proceed, I'd like to wish each one of you a very safe and healthy, day ahead. And I'm sure that this is an unprecedented experience, so we all have to be extra careful. And I trust everyone in your family and your near and dear ones are all well. Though the lockdown has eased a little bit, but there are still a lot of restrictions, more so for clubs. I'm going to take this opportunity to tell you what exactly that the club has started doing to allow the members to come and use the club. First of all, this is our third library talk, and we felt that in these days when everybody's stuck in the house, you need to connect with each other. So we thought the library talk was a good way to connect, and this will be the third one, as I mentioned. And we are also planning other virtual events which will be held in due course, and of course the communication would be sent to you. We're trying to do some, besides library talk, we're trying to do some entertainment programs, etc. And we are also planning to do the members night on a virtual platform, where not only will you see the participants perform, but you will also get a chance to interact with each other amongst the members. Before I hand it over to Shaurojesh, I'd just like to tell you what the club has already started. On the day of the Amphan cyclone, we started liquor sales by the bottle, of course. Sealed bottles are only allowed to be sold from the club, from our off shop, because a lot of the members felt that after the lockdown, when the liquor shops opened, there was too much of a queue to go and buy something that you wanted. However, we had stocks, so we let all the members know that these are the stocks we've got. If you want it, place an order the day before, come and collect it between 12 and 5. If you can't come yourself, send an authority letter with your membership to collect it. Now we've also started takeaway services. Basically, we are offering bakery, items from the dining room, and of course the Oriental room. So this has gone down well with the members, I must say. A lot of the members have been coming to the club, and they say we've missed the Oriental food, or we've missed the Bengal club food and things like that. So that has gone down very well with the members. We have also opened the library and the sports lounge, somewhere where members can meet and over a cup of tea or coffee or whatever. But of course, all along we are following certain standard operating procedures of distance maintaining, sanitizers outside every outlet. We regularly sanitize the club. The kitchen we take extra precaution where the kitchen is concerned. We make sure everything is spick and span, and we try to make sure that all the norms as laid down by the government are followed. And even now, when we open, we've just opened the Oriental room where members can go and eat in the club. However, the tables are reduced and the safe distancing is maintained, and you have to ensure that there are no more than 4 people sitting on a table, and the tables have been accordingly placed so that the safe distancing is maintained. We eventually also plan to open the dining room, again with distancing the tables and maintaining safe distancing. However, just to make sense, it's going to be only selected people who come. We have requested that you place your order the day before, whether it's takeaway or whether you want to come and eat at the restaurant or at the dining room. Once the dining room opens, you place your order the day before. so that, that just that much can be prepared. Pardon me. Otherwise, if we do it like a normal day, then, there could be a lot of wastage. And during these times, wastage is something we just can't afford. And obviously, like any other club and any other such establishment, the clubs are perhaps amongst the latest to get the permission to open. We still, liquor permission has not yet been given to anybody. So the liquor is not yet available except steel bottles, which you have to consume outside the club. So you can't buy a bottle and consume it in the club. So we are trying to keep the engagement of the members going. We are hoping, we are requesting members from containment areas not to come. All the regulations that the government has laid out. We will issue a standard operating procedure, which will tell you what you can do and what is expected of you. After all, your safety is of paramount importance to the club, and the club, from the club side, they're maintaining hygiene and everything. One other thing is, there are some of the staff members that have been staying in the club right through the lockdown, and so far, with God's grace, nobody has been detected with COVID, in spite of the fact that, as you know, the quarters are dormitory style. So nobody has been detected with COVID as yet. The usual protocol of taking the temperature when you enter the club, and there's a foot pedal sanitizer when you enter the club, and you are requested to wear your mask whenever you're in the club. Of course, while you're eating, you take them off. And we will also keep a tab as to who are the people who served you, who are the people that were around you. God forbid if somebody does get COVID post their visit, then we can accordingly inform the people that they should perhaps get themselves checked if they've seen any signs. So we are taking all kinds of precautions, keeping the members' health in mind, and we do hope that this will also encourage you all to come and use the facilities which you all so much enjoy. And I just wanted to give you an update on that. The last point I'll make is, we are under a financial strain, there's no doubt about it. There's been no income, and without income, but expenses are there. So we are trying to, we've said, like cash is king. We are trying to conserve cash every possible way. And one of the big ideas of selling the liquor was whatever inventory we had, if we could sell it, we would liquidate and bring that much cash in. Until the bar permits are given, of course, we won't need to buy any more liquor. So that's all I wanted to take, Shauraji, is just to inform the members about what we are doing, and we hope to see you there soon. And again, stay safe, stay well. Thank you very much. Shauraji, it's back to you.
Thank you so much, Shraddha, and we do hope that everybody uses the club along the guidelines that Shraddha just said. Let me introduce you now to today's speaker, Manu S. Pillai. Even to history buffs in this and many other parts of the country, the early modern Deccan is virtually unknown territory. Apart from the fact that Aurangzeb went there to conquer it and died there while still trying to subdue it, many, not all of course, many of us will not be able to say much more. And that's where Manu comes in. He's not yet 30 and he has already authored 3 enchanting books: The Ivory Throne, Rebel Sultans, and the subject of today's talk, the Courtesan, the Mahatma, and the Italian Brahman. Asked in a recent interview about how he chose his subjects, he said, and I quote, "I am drawn to stories that are not regularly told, the ones that are neglected. The first book was about a Travancore queen who was essentially footnoted and forgotten. The second book was about the history of the Deccan from the 13th century to the 18th, because everyone talked about the Marathas and the Mughals, and I said, hold on, this is a fascinating universe in its own right, even without the Marathas and the Mughals. It deserves a storyteller on its own." So let me hand you over to tonight's wonderful storyteller Manu S. Pillai.
Thank you, sir, for that very generous introduction. I must firstly confess that I did turn 30 in February, so that statement that I'm no longer 30 doesn't quite hold. I'll just quickly share my screen if I have that option here. There you go. Oh wait, it says disabled for me. If you can just set that on.
Disabled what?
The screen sharing.
Yeah,
Okay,
I have enabled it. I have enabled.
Okay, great. Just got it. Thank you. There you go. I'll quickly just put this up. You mentioned my 3 books. Now I'll just start quickly with the first book, which is called The Ivory Throne. I'll just quickly go through this whole idea of lost stories and forgotten stories. Now, I did this book. I started doing this book when I was 19 because I stumbled on the story of these 2 very interesting women of the Travancore royal family. They were both granddaughters of the celebrated painter Raja Ravi Varma, except that they were uplifted into royal status because the Travancore royal family was matrilineal. So every time North Indian Rajas ran out of heirs, they used to adopt boys. So, the Raja of Tanjore in 1787 adopted a boy. Sayajirao Gaikwad of Baroda was adopted in the mid-1870s, again as a boy. The Mysore royal family always tended to run out of heirs every 2 generations. So they, adopting boys from their wider family networks. But in Travancore, it was girls who were adopted. And these 2 girls, Ravi Varma's granddaughters, were adopted and brought in. The lady on the right that you see is Setu Lakshmi Bai, the last senior Maharani of the state. And the lady on the left is Setu Parvati Bai. Now, what is interesting is that this photograph, where if you view it, on the one hand, of course, they have their strange, outlandish hairstyles, and you can in the back you can see that thatch wall with that fake screen put in for the photograph and all that. But really, the photograph also encapsulates a very complicated relationship between these 2 sisters, because originally when they were adopted, of course, they were siblings. They were brought in. There was nothing in terms of competition. But very quickly, once they were installed in these positions of power, their childhood ceased to exist. They became institutions. One ceased to be a 5-year-old child. This is, of course, when they were 10 years old, this photograph. But they were adopted when they were 5 and 4. And they suddenly found themselves transformed into institutions. They no longer had a childhood. They no longer were allowed personalities. They were necessarily these institutions. So the lady on the right, Setu Lakshmi Bai, was relatively shy, even though officially, as the eldest female in the family, the limelight was on her. And the lady on the left, the junior Rani, she hated being in the shadows. She hated that tag of being called junior. She was the one who was actually keen to be royalty. She was keen to sort of go out, express herself and all of that. And the story of the Ivory Throne at one level is about the conflict between these 2 sisters. The one on the right, at the age of 5, she becomes Maharani of Travancore. By the time she's in her teens, she's fighting all kinds of darbar intrigues. By the time she's, in her mid-20s, she started to rule. In her late 30s, she's kicked out of power. She has to relinquish power to her sister's son, the heir who comes of age. After that, she's marginalized. In her late 40s, of course, independence happens in 1947. The kingdom of which she was queen from the age of 5 ceases to exist. And then in the mid-50s, when she's just over 60 years old, communists come to power in Kerala. So, suddenly from a universe where her name is Sri Padmanabha Sevini, Vanchidharma Vardhini, Raja Rajeshwari, Maharani, Puradam Tirunal, Setu Lakshmi Bai Maharaja. And that's what women who ruled were called in Kerala. They were called Maharajas full, not just Maharanis. She then simply becomes Srimati Setu Lakshmi Bai, gives up her palaces, gives up her riches, moves from Travancore, or the Travancore region in Kerala, which her family ruled for over 1,000 years, moves to Bangalore and dies in complete obscurity there in 1985. And she's cremated in an electric crematorium like anybody's grandmother, unremembered, forgotten, etc., etc. The lady on the left, however, was much better at politics and intrigue. She didn't get along with her sister. She's the one who cornered her sister in the family. She produced a son who occupied the position of Maharaja. She controlled that son in many ways. It was well known in her time that she and the prime minister were the real powers behind the throne, where the son was just essentially parked there to allow his mother to continue to exercise power. And she was, in the words of a British resident, called the villain of the piece because she was not very popular. Her politics was very mixed up. And all of that happened. But she ended up, so the so-called villain ended up dying in the palace in 1983 in great comfort, whereas the hero of the story ended up having to go. And what was interesting was that both of these were women, and both of these, protagonist and antagonist happened to be female, which is not something you normally find in Indian history stories. But the other thing the book also tries to achieve is to talk about the matrilineal system and the unraveling of the matrilineal system. So in these images that you see, the man on the right, who's also sitting with his wife in the left side photograph, he was the Maharaja of Travancore from 1860 to 1880. Except that in the matrilineal system, the Maharaja's wife is not the Maharani. So the family unit is not man, wife, and children. The family unit is man, sister, and her children. So in this case, the Maharaja's wife you see here, she was a very talented woman. Her name was Kalyani. Her father was a former prime minister of Courtesan state in Kerala. She was originally married to a Kathakali actor. She actually eloped with a Kathakali actor from her father's place and ran off to Trivandrum. At some point, she met the Maharaja. The Maharaja decided he wanted to marry her. So she discarded the Kathakali actor and ended up with the Maharaja, becoming Amachi. Amachi basically simply meant Mother of His Highness's children. She was not the queen. She was not royalty in her own right. So on the one hand, this picture encapsulates the idea that, we often think our ancestors had this very stereotypical, cliched existence where they sat with their spines erect, thinking chaste thoughts all day long. Whereas here you have a woman in the 1850s, and then in the 1860s, eloping, getting married to an actor, then giving him up for a Maharaja. And she wasn't the only one. Even in her own, father's principality, in the principality of Cochin, there are princes who married widows. There are princes who've again married divorcees. It was perfectly normal in Kerala for that to happen. So there were women who did have a degree of autonomy. But the matrilineal system is also interesting because, as I said, the Maharaja's sister is the Maharani. And simultaneously, just as the Maharaja's wife is not the queen and is not royal, the Maharani's husband is also a commoner. He is also a subject. So what is interesting is that, in the case of Sethu Lakshmi Bai, if you go back in the case of these two women here, when they were both 10 years old, they were presented boys. They were asked to look down from a balcony and presented a number of boys. And they were asked, pick whichever one you choose and, whichever one you like. And that's how both of them got married. Except that the husbands of these Maharanis had no status. They had 250 rupees a month in salary from the Travancore government. They were allowed room and board, not in the main palace. They had to live originally in an outhouse. They were permitted a carriage, and that was it. And other than meals, they had nothing more in terms of status. Officially, they were not supposed to be seen in the presence of their wives in a position of equality. So when Sethu Lakshmi Bai on the right went out driving in 1915 with her husband in the same car as her, it was seen as the breach of protocol because the husband was sitting next to her, and that was completely not allowed. He may be your husband, but he has no entitlement to be seen as your equal, to be seated next to you. Husbands were not allowed to call their royal wives by name. They had to call them Your Highness. They were not originally, in the first few years of marriage, they couldn't go to the royal bedchamber when they liked. They had to wait to be summoned to the queen's bedchamber, which was usually done when the royal astrologers decided, where the moon was and where Saturn was and what time was auspicious to make love, etc., etc. They were, so much for our embarrassment now about sex education. When these men got married to the Ranis, it was the temple priest who basically told them what was and what was not acceptable when making love to a princess. These Maharanis, as I said, had a string of about 15, 16 titles. Their husbands were just Mr. XYZ. They had no other status. The husbands were not even allowed to die in the palace. Every time a royal consort, as they were called, was on his deathbed, he would be lifted with the bed and taken to die elsewhere because only royalty was allowed to die in the palace, which meant that only the queen and her children would die at the palace, and they would not attend their own father/husband's funeral because he may be their father, he may be their husband, but he was still a subject of the state. So that was the matrilineal system. But the book, and this is something that exists in all my three books so far, is that it's also about power. It's also about how historically power has been negotiated by Indian figures and how in many ways it relates to present day exercise of power. So this was one of the Maharajas of Travancore in the 18th century called Martanda Varma. And what's interesting about Martanda Varma is you see him on the right, of course, in a regular portrait, but on the left, what you see is Martanda Varma performing this great temple ritual. In the 18th century, the Travancore royals were pretty much just first among equals in a very feudal, very fragmented state system. The king's blood was not sacred. The king was not any kind of special person. The nobles often thwarted the king's intentions. Martanda Varma came to power. He conquered a series of little kingdoms and principalities in southern Kerala, established a centralized state, and in fact established it as a Hindu state. We talk about a Hindu Rashtra today. He actually, and Travancore would define itself throughout the 19th century as the Hindu state of Travancore, by which he meant basically a Hindu identity. Ironically, it was constructed using British arms supplied by the English East India Company. Their troops were trained by a Dutch prisoner of war turned, a supporter called Mark Delanoy. Their troops were all, many of their troops were mercenaries brought in from Tamil country. And that's how this Hindu state was created, with the help of a lot of non-Malayali elements. But the king also realized that power alone does not help you. Power requires almost instantly this other important component called legitimacy. And that is what he's doing in the left side picture. Now, this ceremony is called Padmagarbha, but the original ceremony, for which we don't have an image, is called Hiranyagarbha. Basically, the king wants to upgrade himself in caste. Now, although we think that the caste system was a very rigid thing and there was no movement, often it was possible to flout it or at least make it slightly more flexible. So you find throughout Indian history, there were kings who found ways to upgrade themselves from Shudra status to officially classical sort of Kshatriya status. And that's what Martanda Varma is doing in this picture on the left. So the custom of Hiranyagarbha, the ritual is very interesting. The wannabe Kshatriya would first have to identify a suitable cow with all the auspicious symbols, etc. Once the cow was identified, a golden model of the cow would have to be constructed with, pure gold. But if you were a poor king, you could do it in copper and just plate it with gold. Once this was done, the Raja would have to enter through the mouth of the cow and sit inside the cow for a certain duration. Brahmins, who were of course well paid for this purpose, they would sit there chanting mantras and pelt it with flowers and gomutra and all kinds of things and chant mantras that were specific to birth. And then after a certain duration, once these birth mantras had been chanted, the Raja would emerge from under the tail of the cow, except that the man who went in as a Shudra warlord would emerge from under the tail of the cow now as this highborn Kshatriya prince, now entitled to wear the sacred thread of the Kshatriyas, now in a position to claim descent from the sun, the moon, whichever planet or celestial being he wanted to claim descent from, and connect his genealogy to all kinds of epic heroes. So, and this was not just Martanda Varma. Shivaji, of course, famously did this in 1674, where he installed himself as Chhatrapati. One of the Nayaka rulers in Madurai did this with this added detail in his Hiranyagarbha ceremony, where when he emerged from under the tail of the cow, he also had to land in the lap of the priest's wife and bawl like a baby, so that nobody had any doubts about this rebirth of his. Hiranyagarbha essentially allowed them to become twice born, to be born again into a caste that was not originally theirs, into the caste that they wished to have. Which also meant that after this was done, the Rajas had to ensure that there was a lot of protocol around the royal family. So, for instance, when, in the case of this particular Maharaja, there was a lot of artificial vocabulary used about the royal family. So when the Maharaja woke up in the morning, he did not brush his teeth like you and me. Malayalis would call it Pallithekuva, but the Raja doesn't do that. What the Raja does is Tirumutta Vilaka, the cleaning of the royal pearls. Because when you talk about royalty, they don't have teeth, they have royal pearls. Every time the Raja or the Rani, in the case of these two women, when the Ranis got pregnant, it was never called pregnancy or Garbham. It was the proclamation said Tiruvayar Vanu, which basically meant the royal womb is occupied. And then when the baby was born, it would say Tiruvayar Orinyu, the royal womb is vacated, because royalty does not do such mortal things as give birth. They only have their wombs occupied and then vacated by semi-divine beings. The Rajas, they went out and they consecrated their kingdom and surrendered it very grandly to the Padmanabha Swami temple, which was a means to sort of bypass any criticism. Because still yesterday, you could criticize the Raja and call him an invader, an upstart, a man who was originally of low caste, etc., etc. But once you've surrendered your conquests to God and start ruling as God's regent on earth, well, any criticism can be used as criticism of God himself. It's a little bit like today's debates from national and anti-national, but that was essentially the same principle. Your public relations and the spin and the narrative you construct around power is always of importance. Now, power was again the reason I did my second book, which was this history of the Deccan. As I said, we talk a lot about the Mughals and the Marathas and forget that the Deccan has its own interesting rulers in its own interesting space. Now, these two images for me encapsulate that world of the Deccan. If you look at the elephant in the left side picture, it's a very simple picture, very vivid colors. And the elephant in many ways is representative of India. It's that quintessential Indian animal. Even when the first Islamic invaders came in from the northwest, this was one of those animals they would drag back to Afghanistan or wherever, Persia, etc., because they were fascinated with the idea of the elephant. But look at the two people seated atop the elephant. The man in the front is one of the Adil Shahs of Bijapur. Adil Shah was their title. They were the sultans of Bijapur. And behind him is one of his nobles called Ikhlas Khan. Now you'll notice that the color of their skin is different. One is fairer, the other is darker. Now the fair man, the Adil Shah of Bijapur, on the face of it, if you just casually hear the name Muhammad Adil Shah or Abdullah Adil Shah, for example, you'll think, oh, yet another Islamic ruler in India. But the Adil Shahi dynasty was founded by an immigrant from Persia. Some people say he came from Georgia. He himself, his descendants would later claim he was this lost Ottoman prince who had to escape violence in the palace, and that's why he came to India. But in reality, he was just a nobody, a mercenary who came looking for opportunity and work in India. He ended up joining what was then called the Bahmani Sultanate, and Bahmani Sultanate would soon fade and collapse into these successor states of the Deccan. And here he ended up marrying not a Muslim woman, but a Maratha woman, the sister of a major nobleman called Mukundrao. And it was this half Persian, half Maratha couple that that created this Adil Shahi dynasty. And the Adil Shahs were also not unlike the Mughals, they were not Sunni Muslims. Most of them preferred Shia Islam. They did not look up to the Mughals as their overlords. They were besotted with Safavid Persia, with Shia culture, and that was the direction in which their policies were oriented. They had access to the sea, so they were not landlocked or not, their links were not with Central Asia as it was for the Mughals, for example. So right on an Indian elephant, you have this half Hindu, half Maratha ruler. Behind him, the man you see, which is also the man on the right side, same background, is an African. Now, this is the other thing we never realize. All of you are sitting in Bengal. There was a time in the 15th century when very briefly there was a Hakshi rule in Bengal. Hakshi is the word for Africans, where a group of African mercenaries captured power and held it for about a decade. People in a place like Uttar Pradesh, Jaunpur, for example, don't realize that for about a century, there was a Hakshi dynasty of black rulers in Uttar Pradesh. In Ahmedabad, one of the most iconic mosques was constructed by a Hakshi, an African. And here again, the chief nobleman and the chief minister of this particular Adil Shah is Ikhlas Khan, also an African. But the most exciting or the most glamorous African in Indian history is the man on the right. His name is Malikambar. And Malikambar is interesting because he was born into the Oromo tribe of Ethiopia. He was enslaved by a random set of people and sold in Baghdad. His master in Baghdad converted him to Islam, and that's how he took the name Ambar. From there, he was shipped to Goa. And in Goa, he was purchased by the Peshwa, or the prime minister of the Sultan of Ahmednagar. Now, the Sultan of Ahmednagar was himself descended from a Brahmin. Two of the sultans had black wives, which is to say that in Ahmednagar, now a tier 2/tier 3 town in India, there were black queens till as recently as the 17th century. And they used to send their bodies, these Nizam Shahs or the sultans of Ahmednagar used to send their bodies to be buried in Karbala, which is now in Iraq. It's just remarkable to think, if you close your eyes and think of a Brahmin line with Persian, African wives, as well as Maratha wives sending their bodies to be buried in Iraq, it gives you a sense of that plurality and diversity. And African nobility was an important element. So Malikambar comes there as a slave originally, but these are not slaves in the American sense. These are slaves as military soldiers, because often kings needed a set of soldiers who would stay loyal only to them. So these Africans had no cultural roots in India. They didn't come with women and children. There was no way for them to establish a community as such in India. So they would stay loyal to their patron. That was the understanding. And Malikambar was loyal to his patron for many years. Then he was set free. He was, given his liberty at a certain point about 20 years later, and he became a warlord with about 300, 400 odd cavalrymen with him. Later, once the Mughal invasions start in the Deccan in the 1590s, obviously there's a vacuum in power. The Ahmednagar Sultanate starts to collapse. The Mughals are starting to seize territory. And this man finds opportunity in that. He starts developing his own following, his own band of loyalists. So from 300, it becomes 500 supporters. From that, it becomes 3,000 supporters. Then it's 7,000 supporters. And before you know it, he's got 20,000 supporters with him. And Malikambar supporters were not just African, ex-slaves and military men like him. They were also from this interesting community that is very important in today's Indian politics and in history, namely the Marathas. In fact, one of Malikambar's right-hand men was a man called Manoji Bhosle, whose grandson was none other than Shivaji Bhosle, the founder of the Maratha Empire, or the Maratha Kingdom. And in fact, Shivaji himself in the 1670s would commission a Sanskrit poem called the Shiva Bharata. And in the Shiva Bharata, a great there's encomiums that are loaded on Malikambar because he's called as brave as the sun compared to Hindu gods. When Shivaji's father helps him in battle, it's compared to Kartikeya fighting the demons. It's given that same analogy. So Malikambar was this African man who commanded tremendous respect in the Deccan. But the Deccan was also the place where another ruler in Bijapur called Ibrahim Adil Shah reigned. He was a contemporary of Akbar, a late contemporary of Akbar, and an exact contemporary of Emperor Jahangir. But in many ways, he was the Akbar of the Deccan. Now, again, what's interesting about him is that, once a Mughal ambassador came to his court, and the ambassador was horrified to discover that Ibrahim Adil Shah II did not speak Persian very fluently. But you must remember, till the 1830s was the language of diplomacy and trans-regional communication in India. So when the Maharani of Travancore in the 1810s would write a letter to the governor of Madras, in Madras, obviously, who was British, she would use neither Malayalam nor English. She would use Persian. If the British had not imposed English on us, it's very likely we would have been having this conversation. Some of you are Bengalis, I'm a Malayali sitting in Maharashtra. We may still have been having this conversation in Persian. But Ibrahim did not speak Persian. When the Mughal ambassador came, he was horrified to find he spoke Marathi because Ibrahim celebrated the Maratha side of his heritage and genealogy. He celebrated the Hindu side of his genealogy. In fact, Ibrahim was, he was one of the few Adil Shahs who chose to be Sunni rather than Shia. But what is interesting is that he wrote this Dakhni work called the Kitab-i-Norras. And in the Kitab-i-Norras, the first line is an invocation to the goddess Saraswati. The Prophet Muhammad only comes in the second line. Ibrahim, in fact, goes so far as to call himself the son of the pure Saraswati and Guru Ganapati, two important Hindu gods. And that the image on the left is of special importance. It's one of the finest examples or the most interesting examples of Deccan art. Because if you look at it at one glance, it's any other Islamic princess. The clothes are Islamic, the format is Islamic, the style is Islamic. There are several, palpably Islamic elements in this painting. But if you look closely, this is actually Ibrahim Saraswati. She's got the conch, she's got the veena, she's got all those emblems of Saraswati that you find in Hindu iconography, except that he has visualized his Saraswati in a Persianate/Islamic style. It's this wonderful mix of cultures. Ibrahim, when he was also an extremely eccentric man. When once Akbar, of course, brought him to terms, got him to agree to send one of his daughters into the Mughal harem. And Ibrahim tried everything in his power to prevent this from happening. So when the first Mughal ambassador was sent to his court to try and negotiate a treaty and get this princess to the Mughal harem, Ibrahim, instead of saying no, he just diplomatically started bribing the ambassador, getting him to prevaricate, delay, vacillate, and several years passed this way till an Akbar, who was nearly on his deathbed, got so frustrated he sent a second ambassador saying, you can't stay in Bijapur for more than one night and you must get that princess to the Mughal harem. And what's interesting is Ibrahim still wouldn't give up. When the ambassador reached a distance of about 2 weeks from Bijapur, Ibrahim basically said, oh, you must stop there now for some time because I'm not prepared to receive you yet. And started bombarding the ambassador with biryani, with dancing girls, with conversationalists, with every distraction possible to prevent him from coming to Bijapur. Once he came to Bijapur, he tried to induce the ambassador to stay on and, just sort of hang around and, accept bribes. But the ambassador was very loyal to Akbar. He said, absolutely not. Now, finally, Ibrahim had no option but to hand over his daughter. But at the final meeting with the ambassador, he looked at the ambassador and saw that he was wearing the special badge. Now, some of you may know about this group that Akbar created with a special philosophy called Din Ilahi. It was not a religion as such, but it was for his disciples, combining different spiritual elements and trying to create something new. And they used to wear this particular token or a badge. And Ibrahim said, "Oh, what's this interesting thing?" And he asked to look at it. And having got it in his hand, he told the ambassador, oh, well, I'm now an honorary member of the Din Ilahi set of disciples of the emperor, so I'm going to keep this. Now, the ambassador was in a fix because having been given the badge by Akbar, he couldn't return to the Mughal court without it. Equally, he couldn't flout Akbar's order to leave within one day. And here you have Ibrahim, who had taken the badge and walked away because he wanted to prevent the ambassador from leaving with his daughter. Finally, of course, the ambassador left. He pitched his tent outside the city at some distance and started lobbying Ibrahim for the return of his badge. It was finally accomplished after some days. But Ibrahim had one last trick up his sleeves. Halfway through the journey to the Mughal court, he ensured that his daughter would run away from the Mughal camp and try to come back to Bijapur. Of course, she was caught, and that was the end of the story. So there was, in the Deccan, there were characters, there were a lot of interesting things happening. There were these kings, some of them used to define themselves in very outwardly Islamic terms. Others used to define themselves in very Hinduized terms. Even the Deccan's other prominent empire, the Vijayanagar emperors, they used to style themselves Hindu Raya Suratrana, sultans among Hindu kings. Yes, their self-image was Sanskritic, it was Hinduized in many ways, but they were also part of a Persianate universe. If you look at, some of the sculptures in Hampi, if you ever get to go there once the lockdown is over, you'll see that as time passes, the people of Vijayanagar were not wearing what you would imagine were saris or very Indian clothes. They were starting to wear very Persianate fashions because Persian clothes were the rage at the time. Now I'll finally come to my third book and some of its contents, which is called The Courtesan, the Mahatma, and the Italian Brahmin. Now, the title, some ask me, is very serpentine and rather long. In the age of hashtags and social media, I haven't been able to find a hashtag in which it can fit. But each of the elements of the title is meant to reflect some of its thematic or research interests. So the courtesan refers to the fact that in Indian history, we don't really pay attention to the women who were there. Why is it that Indian history is still broadly about 5 kings, 5 battles, a few empires? Where are the women? It is not that they are absent. The women are there. In the Deccan, you have Chand Bibi. You have someone like Kunza Humayun, who was so prominent and powerful that her son, the Sultan of Ahmednagar, got so paranoid he had to scratch her out of miniature paintings and convert her into a blob because he didn't want her to even be remembered in paintings and art. You have someone like Begum Khadija, who the Dutch have this fascinating anecdote about her journey to Mecca and how the Dutch organized a ship for her and how she was this very imperious woman. There are these women. There are women poets. There are women scholars. All of them exist. We just don't go looking for them. So the lady you see on your screen now is somebody called Begum Samru. Begum Samru was born in the mid-18th century. She was originally a dancing girl in a brothel / Tavaif Khana in Chandni Chowk. Somewhere in the 1860s, she met a German mercenary with an army of about 3,000 odd people. This particular German mercenary was called the Butcher of Patna because once for an Indian Nawab, he had captured some Englishmen there. And then he told them, you're prisoners of war, I'll treat you well, and invited them to dinner. Except that once they all sat down for dinner, he had their throats cut. So he was called the Butcher of Patna. And she ended up becoming a companion / lover to the Butcher of Patna and moved out of this dancing girl profession and became a traveling member with his army. When he died, Begum Samru was very clever. She was not his official wife. She not only edged out the official wife and the son, she took charge of the army. So suddenly the dancing girl became the head of a mercenary army. As the years passed, her power increased. It started swelling in her prominence started growing. And at one point, when the Mughal Emperor Shah Alam was besieged in Delhi, it was this ex-dancing girl turned military leader who sort of rode to his rescue, for which she was given titles like Pillar of the State, Daughter of the Emperor, not the usual things you would associate with a courtesan or a former dancing girl. She had this very interesting life where she ended up having a romance with an Irishman, wanted to marry a Frenchman. Her troops mutinied, tied her to a gun carriage, left her to die in the sun for a whole week in the middle of the summer in North India. She bounced back, survived, got rid of that husband that they didn't like, the Frenchman, reclaimed the loyalties of her army. And by 1835, when she died as a very old woman, she was one of the richest women in Northern India. And also, ironically, in an age when Hindu culture and Islamic culture dominated, she did this very unusual thing of converting to Christianity. So, and she built one of the biggest churches in North India in Sardana. And this is the story of a courtesan turned warrior, turned princess, turned daughter of the Mughal emperor, turned wealthy woman in India. In fact, her fortune remains still unclaimed. And there's a website where you can go and lodge your claim if you can prove that you have some family connection to her, because she didn't have any children. But why is it that we don't really learn much about Begum Samru? For the simple reason that she was not a man. And for the other reason that even as a woman, she did not have a Mangal Sutra or a wedding badge around her neck. So you see, her contemporary was a man called Mahatji Scindia. And Mahatji Scindia was, he's got this rags to riches story. He came from a family who were slipper carriers to the Peshwas of the Marathas. From there, he became this warrior, generals. He ended up establishing the Scindia state in Gwalior, which is still a very prominent family. So that story is respected because it's rags to riches, but it's a man's story. But when a woman does it in the same period simultaneously, because she's unmarried, because she was once a dancing girl, and because there's that taint of being a courtesan, we don't really hear her story. But it is always an interesting story. In fact, there's this iconic photograph of Indira Gandhi sitting at her desk, surrounded by men in a very groveling and obsequious pose. And I see a similar thing in this painting, where you have Begum Samru, not in parda, not your cliched, caricatured Orthodox Indian woman, seated at the center of a court, surrounded by Englishmen, surrounded by these men who are all her servants, her managers, her commanders, etc., etc. It's a sense of power. She was a woman of tremendous power. Now, that was the courtesan element, which talked about Indian history and the place of women. But the place of women is not merely about historical figures. How we even treat epic characters is interesting. So the picture on the right, the lady in the red sari, is supposed to be by Raja Ravi Varma. Here she's being taken away by her mother, the great Apsara. Now what's interesting is you've got that characteristic familiar story of Shakuntala, which is that King Dushyanta comes into the ashram where, she's being raised by a rishi. He falls in love with this lady, and, the dialogue's actually quite interesting. You woman with wonderful thighs, you buxom lady, etc., etc. And she's, of course, very shy and docile, etc., etc. And he says, look, I'm really in love with you, so let's do a Gandharva Vivaha. Gandharva Vivaha is that form of marriage which makes up for lack of patience and ceremony, and you can just get down to the business. And in the end, of course, he leaves her a ring. He says, keep this ring with you, and then I'll finally, reclaim you, etc. Now, another rishi comes to that ashram, and he's completely horrified and offended because, Shakuntala's heads are in the clouds. She's lost in all these romantic thoughts and not paying any attention to the rishi. So he curses her, saying, the man that you've been thinking about will forget you. Now, naturally, Shakuntala, being very docile, is, all tears and weeping, and her dasis and maids come running to the rishi and say, oh, Ayo, Pavam, she didn't really mean it. Why don't you forgive her? So the man lifts the curse slightly and says, okay, well, the ring that he gave you, when he sees that ring, he will remember your great romance. Naturally, Shakuntala goes. On the way, she loses her ring. The king does not recognize her. She's again collapses into a heap of tears. Her mother, the Apsara, shows up to rescue her and flies away. And that's how the story continues. Except that this is Kalidasa's Shakuntala that was written only in the 5th or 4th century CE. It was not the original Shakuntala. We need to talk more about this Shakuntala for several reasons. But the original Shakuntala of the Mahabharata is a much more direct and forthright Shakuntala. In the original Mahabharata story, when King Dushyanta comes in the ashram, there are no maids, there are no interlocutors who are trying to sort of, get conversation going between these two. They talk directly. Shakuntala looks him in the eye. First he says, well, lie with me, woman of wonderful thighs. And she says, no, thank you. Then when he insists, she says, okay, fine. But she first extracts a promise from him. She says that if this happens, our son must be your heir to the throne. So before Shakuntala gets it on with Dushyanta, she actually extracts a promise from him. Once that is done, she gets pregnant. She has this peculiar 36-month pregnancy, and she goes to Dushyanta's court with her son in her arms. Now, there is no curse, there is no other rishi, there is no ring in the original Mahabharata story. In the original Mahabharata story, when Shakuntala gets there, Dushyanta has not forgotten her because of a curse. He deliberately lies. He thinks that, oh, what will my courtiers think if a stray lady walks into my court with a child saying it's mine, my image will look bad, and therefore I'm going to just pretend I don't know her. To which Shakuntala does not collapse into a heap of tears. She actually retorts and says, even without you, my son will rule all 3 worlds. You may rule the earth, I fly the skies. She's not a docile woman. She looks him in the eye and essentially calls him a liar. That is when, of course, a magical voice says, Dushyanta, you better not lie, etc., etc. And Dushyanta says, yes, I'm sorry I said this. And I forgive Shakuntala for her harsh words, because, even in a relatively feminist reading of the story, there is a hint of patriarchy. But the reason we speak more about the Kalidas Shakuntala, where she's docile, it's because by then the idea of womanhood had changed. And that idea of womanhood is what was interesting to the man on the left. This man, many of you in Calcutta would know, Sir William Jones of the Asiatic Society, the great Orientalist. He was the one who translated Shakuntala first with his Pandit and sent it off to Europe. It was staged in very many places. It sort of took European intellectual circles by rage, except that William Jones preferred the Kalidas Shakuntala for, of course, it was a beautiful play, etc., but it was also because it appealed and fit Western sensibilities better. But he also was up to a little bit of mischief of his own, which was that when he translated Shakuntala, Kalidasa Shakuntala, he actually removed a lot of its sensuality. He took away a lot of its erotic sort of undertones. For example, there's this one bit where Shakuntala's physique is described, body is described as sweaty. He turns that into glowing skin because he doesn't want to talk about sweaty bodies. Then there's another bit where Shakuntala's face is sad and her shoulders are drooping and her breasts are sagging, except that William Jones translates the face and the shoulders and leaves out the breasts completely because that wouldn't fit his Western audience. So it was that, not only was it Kalidas's version of Shakuntala at the cost of the original Mahabharata Shakuntala, it was then a sanitized, censored Shakuntala who went to Europe, came back to us in very many books and textbooks, and that is the one we remember. The other element, I won't dwell on this because we're running out of time. Then there's the other part of the title, which is the courtesan, the Mahatma, and the Italian Brahman. The Mahatma doesn't really refer to Mahatma Gandhi. It refers to Mahatma Phule. Because again, as I said earlier, we often think our ancestors were these chaste people who obeyed all the strictures of law, all these religious codes, and lived these ultra pious lives. But you actually discover that there was always a sense of dissent in Indian history. In the 12th century, Basava said, loaded with the weight of the Vedas, the Brahmin is a veritable donkey. It was a very blunt statement. He was against caste. He was against ritualism. And in the 12th century, he said it. In the 12th century, he got an intercaste marriage done, which is why his people were lynched. Just as today, intercaste marriages get people lynched. Then a few centuries later, you have Kabir. When Brahmins claimed that they were superior because they were born from the head of the cosmic creator, Kabir lampooned them by asking, does that mean the cosmic creator had the birth canal is the ear? Is that how you were all born? Come down to the 19th century, and this man in the image, Mahatma Phule, who was that original Mahatma in India, when the Brahmins of Pune, Western India, Pune is this extremely orthodox Brahmin city. The Peshwas, who are orthodox Brahmins, ruled from there, and Phule was born there as the grandson of a Mali, a gardener, into what is now an OBC community. And he, after an education, a mission education that gave him access to sort of global literature, what was happening in the United States, Europe, all of that, he was a very well-read man. When the Brahmins said they were superior because they were born from the head of the cosmic creator, Phule actually turned around and said in Orthodox Pune, well, does that mean the cosmic creator menstruates through the mouth? So the Mahatma in the title refers to that dissent. It refers to that tendency to sort of ask the inconvenient questions, especially in a time when we are again being told that to be patriotic, to be nationalistic is to obey and listen and not question anything. Well, questioning is very much part of our culture. And finally, the last element in the title, the Italian Brahmin. Now, the Italian Brahmin is actually the story of a real, very interesting and colorful man called Roberto de Nobili, who came off as a missionary. He was born in a very aristocratic family in Italy in the 1570s. But he decided he didn't want lands and riches. He wanted to become a missionary. So he got on a boat, landed up in Goa, moved from there to Kochi, but very quickly realized he didn't want to have much to do with the Portuguese, and moved to an inland mission with the grand conversion rate of 0 in Madurai. Now, Madurai was this temple town, the great Meenakshi temple. This is the age of the Nayaka kingdoms. Even now, if you go there, you'll see Tirumala Nayaka's palace with these magnificent pillars. And in this place, he realized that, converting fisher folk on the beach was one thing, but trying to get into a sort of courtly culture was a completely different game altogether. So he realized that to convert the Hindus, he would actually not have to force them and dragoon them into his European reading of the Catholic faith. He would have to Hinduize the Catholic faith. So Roberto de Nobili starts doing this very interesting thing where firstly, of course, he picks up the languages. Tamil for so, courtly Telugu, because Telugu was the court language in those days, and even in Tamil courts. Sanskrit, of course, when he read the Vedas and started doing all kinds of debates with Brahmins. But more importantly, he realized that to command respect in the eyes of the locals, he would also have to occupy a senior enough caste position. So he started wearing the sacred thread of the Brahmins. Again, so much of a caste. Here you have an Italian, European white man wearing a sacred thread. He started wearing saffron robes because that's what sannyasis and Hindu holy men used to wear. He started having single meals every day, and he would discard it and throw away the fork and the spoon, would sit on the floor and eat out of a plantain leaf, and it was always a South Indian meal cooked by a Brahmin cook. When he went to royal courts, he was received like any other Hindu guru. His feet would be washed by the king. There'd be a tiger skin for him to sit on. He was allotted a palanquin, and people called him the Tattva Bodhakar. That was a Tamil honorific rather than calling him a missionary or a padre or etc. etc. He was a man who managed to convert not only Brahmins, but even a prince, very many high caste people. When he first arrived, the Madurai mission had 0 converts by the time, except a few fishermen. By the time he retired from there, it had thousands of converts. In fact, that is what even today Tamil Catholicism or South Indian Catholicism in many places is heavily influenced by Hindu iconography and Hindu elements because of Roberto de Nebili's what were called Malabar rites. They were called this Hinduized brand of the Catholic faith. So a couple of years ago, there was a Times of India news article about how the Bishop of Belgaum showed up, and social media was completely taken aback to find him in saffron robes with a tika on his forehead and with an arti platter in his hand, because they didn't realize what a Christian was doing with all these things. But that's how Christians in Tamil territory used to work. The Virgin Mary was just seen as another form of the goddess in some places. The chariot processions you have for Hindu devis and Kali, etc., the same thing was done for the Virgin Mary. And the Virgin Mary is even today draped in a sari to make her look even more Indian. And there's actually a place where, I forget the exact location, in Kerala actually, not in Tamil Nadu, in Kerala, where Mary is considered the sister of Bhagavati, the goddess in a nearby temple. That's how, so the Italian Brahman refers to this kind of human inventiveness. It refers to these interesting characters who we've forgotten in Indian history, even though they were so colorful. And finally, I'll end on this final anecdote. Speaking of eccentric, interesting characters. In Tanjore, Shivaji's half-brother, so Shivaji's brother Ekoji, he went and established a Maratha kingdom. And he had a nephew, Ekoji had a son who ruled from 1684 until 1712, which was Shivaji's direct nephew called Shahu or Shahaji. Now, the Shahu was a very interesting ruler. This is not his exact portrait because we don't have a portrait for him. It's a successor's portrait. But Shahu had this very interesting career. He was a Marathi-speaking prince in a court in Madurai, in Tanjore, where the court language was Telugu. His subjects were Tamils, and his army was Rajputs and Bundelas and Afghans. Again, speaking of diversity and multiculturalism, these are not new things. These are familiar in India. But Shahu is most, you can study a king in his usual way with inscriptions and documents about how much revenue he had, etc. But to really gain an insight into a historical figure's mind, you must actually look in some other unconventional sources. Shahu wrote a Telugu play called the Satidana Suramu, which is a parody on the caste system called Take My Wife, if that's the English translation. Now, the Satidana Suramu has this hilarious story, and those are the 4 characters on the right side. There's a Brahmin called Morobhatlu the Magnificent. He's the protagonist of the story, and he's on his way to a great temple festival with his chela or his disciple. But on the way, this great Shastri sees in the distance an extremely beautiful woman. And he stops his disciple and says, "Look, I want to go and flirt with that lady." Now, the disciple says, No, you're a great Pandit, you're a great Shastri. Think about the subtle meaning of Vedic words. And Morobhatlu the Brahmin says, No, I'm not interested in this insipid eternal bliss and spirituality and all that. I just want the bliss that comes with spending an evening with this lady, so I'm going to go talk to her. So that's how they go in front of the lady. The lady turns around, except that she is a Dalit woman. She's an untouchable from the leather worker caste. So she turns around and she's horrified that this man wants to come and flirt with her. So first she says, "Oh, sorry, sir, I'm married, so I can't flirt with you." He says, "Oh, that's fine. That's not a problem. Think of, give me your loins as you would donate land to a Brahmin." Now this woman says, "Damn it, I need to come up with a new excuse." So she says, "Oh, I'm a low caste person, so we can't actually have any dealings." So he says, No, these rules were invented by us Brahmins just to sort of hoodwink people. So you don't bother too much about caste and all that. Finally, the lady says, "Oh, she's thinking, she's pumping her mind for creative ways to get out of the hands of this semi-stalker." And she says, "Oh, we drink liquor and we eat beef, so we're not good enough for a Brahmin like you." And Morobhatlu the Magnificent turns around and says, "Well, I drink cow's milk and I worship the cow. You eat the whole cow. You must be purer than me." Now, to think that in the early 18th century / late 17th century, Shivaji's nephew could say this, whereas today we don't have the cultural confidence. If today a writer or a playwright were to have a dialogue like this in his play or her play, they'd probably get beaten up or face all kinds of court cases. But the difference is in the 18th century, we still had the cultural confidence to be able to stand up and lampoon ourselves. This play was not just for private consumption. It was staged in a temple year after year during a festival and consumed by large numbers of people. It was possible, as I said, to stand up and ask questions, to stand up and express dissent, and stand up and even laugh at some of our own cultural elements and traditions, because that was the whole point of having that cultural security and confidence. I'll end here so that we have some time for questions, and I hope I haven't bored anyone by going on for far too long. Thank you.
No, Manu, as you were speaking, people were commenting on the chat box, which you can see, about how much they liked your talk. Now for the question and answer session. Here are the rules. 1 question per person and not much more. Manu has time for 5 or 6 questions. And please make it a question rather than a statement or an observation. Please type it in the chat box, which you will see at the bottom of the panel, and I will read it out to Manu. From Rajiv Sethi, Manu, how do you do your research?
Well, the usual archives, lots of reading, lots of time in dusty places that most people have forgotten. But increasingly, you find that in today's world, there was a time when history was all about culling facts and data out of books and a few, dusty records. But increasingly, you realize that sources are very diverse. Sources are really, they need to come from a variety of places. For example, if you're talking about the Deccan, for example, it's not just the inscriptional evidence, because inscriptions tend to often exaggerate to a great extent. So you also need to learn to read those by sort of realizing the exaggerations in it. It's also the art. As I said, in Vijayanagar, for example, you realize the Islamic influence, you realize the Persianate influence if you look at the Lepakshi murals, if you look at the sculpture, if you look at the Arab warrior who's been carved into the pillars of the Vitala, the great temple that's there in Vijayanagar, in the ruins of Hampi. So you want architecture, you want art, you want literature. This whole story of Shahu in Tanjore was about literature. As I said, if you look at the man's epigraphical records or his official documents, an insight into his mind that gives you an insight or a flavor of the time itself is his role in creating that piece of fiction. Fiction is a source of history in that sense. If you're talking about partition, you can look at partition with the numbers. So many million people displaced, so many hundreds of thousands caught up in that move of populations. You can talk about the so many women who were raped and violated, the atrocities. But these are numbers. You get the emotional sense of partition in Manto's fiction. Years from now, when a historian writes about partition, they will have to cull the fiction as well to get a sense of it. So increasingly, and you have to also realize that you need to find sources, oral history sources, because in a caste-based society, if you privilege written records, you're actually privileging certain castes. You're privileging people who had access to writing, access to literary, talent. A whole lot of people did not have access to literature. They did not have access to writing. Their sources and their history is recorded in folklore. It's recorded in song. It's recorded in these, what some would call unorthodox sources, but they have value. A historian knows how to read between the lines, remove the exaggerations, find that grain of truth. But you really have to start looking all over the place. Translations help, because in a country like ours, where there are so many languages, I can do Marathi, I can do Hindi, I can do Malayalam and English, but I can't do Kannada and Telugu, for example. I can't do Sanskrit. So I need to then rely on translation. So it's a process that involves very many elements, and it's a time-consuming process, but it's rewarding in its own way.
A question from Arindam Sengupta. Can you tell us a little bit more about the Hakshi rulers and kings in India?
Yeah, so this is one of those. It's one of those forgotten things, because part of it is also racism. Because even it's not like this racism is new. Even at that time, when those two sultans of Ahmednagar took black wives, they were actually criticized for it. Their courtiers from Persia, etc., did not like it. There was a racist element even then. So we tend to sort of expunge them for that reason. But that goes back even to the 13th century. Razia Sultan, the only woman to have ruled the Delhi Sultanate, one of the pretexts for murdering her was that she was very close to an Abyssinian slave turned colleague called Yakut. And this was not something people liked. As I said, they often came in. Not all of them became kings. Not all of them exercised kingly power, but they could often be kingmakers, which is what Malikambar was. When the British started invading, when the Mughals started invading the Deccan, Malikambar not only planted this young sultan on the throne, he got his daughter married to that man. So he ensured that he had a stake in that. But the best place to really get a sense of the prestige many of these people commanded is, of course, the art, where a lot of these African nobles feature in the art, but it's also in poetry. As I said, Shivaji's court poem, the Shiva Bharata, which is officially meant to legitimize him, which is officially meant to sort of convey his kingly identity and ideology. The kind of material that you find on Malikambar there, the kind of material you find on these Islamic sultanates, which allowed this. Now, the Africans came because it was possible to come, right? But now, the thing is, Vijayanagar was the enemy state for a lot of these sultanates. Why is it that Vijayanagar lost, even though it was bigger, even though it had more resources and wealth? One of the reasons was that it was not able to attract international talent as the sultanates were. Because the sultanates were part of a Persian Islamic network, they were able to draw talent from the corners of Eastern Europe, from Ottoman Empire, from the Persian territory, from Central Asia, no matter where. They had networks that were very wide, and they were able to bring in artillery, architects, engineers, the waterworks in places like Bijapur. They were able to get people like that. It was the same commercial Islamic network that brought in these military slaves. That is how they came to India. Today, there are these Hakshi communities in India, but these are a later settlement. These are people who came, say, in the 18th century. They're the ones who are called Hakshis today, and there is a taint attached to them. The earlier generation, Malikambar's kind military Africans who came, they essentially have merged into the Indian community, because what happened is many of them married Maratha women, many of them took local wives of various castes and simply melted down into the Indian population. So in fact, there will be many Indians in the Deccan who wouldn't know that they have African ancestors, and I'm not talking about the original immigrants from Africa, out of Africa, but more recently. And this is not surprising. One of my favorite stories is the story of the last king of Burma. Just as the last Mughal emperor was put on a bullock cart and exiled into Burma, the last Burmese king was exiled to Ratnagiri in Maharashtra, where he, of course, was locked up. His poor daughters didn't have any friends. They were not allowed any sort of society. So his eldest daughter commenced an affair with the Maratha watchman, and a servant, I think. And with that watchman, she had a love child called Tutu. Except that Tutu grew up, and she still had some of her Burmese features, but she grew up, took the Maratha name Baisubai, married another Maratha whose name was Pawar. He was a bus driver. And their children and grandchildren, if you go to Ratnagiri and look at them now, they live very sort of, ordinary lives. But you wouldn't be able to tell they have any Burmese blood, because they've completely sort of Maratha-sized themselves. They've become part of that Hindu Maratha community in Ratnagiri. That's what happened with the Hakshis as well, of that earlier generation. They simply melted down into our genes, and they survive in all of us to some degree or the other.
Right, I'll read you two questions which are along similar lines from Shudipa Bose. How can history be mainstreamed, the history that you are talking about? How can it be mainstreamed in our schools and universities? And along the same lines from Shumit Chatterjee, how do you plan to bring this excellent research to mainstream so that more people get to know about it, especially in the current environment?
So, this whole schools is a completely different game, because you see, what gets decided, what gets taught in schools is decided by governments, and governments usually tend to have differing ideas on this. So every new government will want to amend textbooks to sort of flatter themselves or legitimize their own genealogy, so their own ideology. So what happens is history becomes a bag of tricks and recipes where you go and pick and choose what you like that makes you look best for your current political needs. So my hope really isn't very much at the school level. I think it's at a higher level once people come to university, and the real key really is just getting people to read more books. This is tied to a larger problem of getting people to read, for the simple reason that unless you actually go seeking knowledge, you can't really be spoon-fed knowledge. Now, the stories are there, the fascinating tales are there, these fascinating complexities and details are there. It can never be given in any textbook with all its richness, because then it wouldn't serve any nationalistic or any political purpose. You have to, for any political purpose, you have to sort of bring it down to its bare bones. You have to make it black and white to be able to justify your own present-day black and white ideologies. What history does is it always complicates the past. History is always about complicating received wisdom. It's about complicating what you think you know. It's about complicating every cliche and stereotype we've received and said, hold on, you think this was what our tradition was all about. Hold on, it wasn't quite like this. You think that, all these, these sultans were going in and destroying all these temples. Tipu Sultan, for example, it's that conventional belief. He was extremely brutal in Malabar, for example, during his conquest. But you can still nuance that in the sense that he went out and destroyed temples that were patronized by his enemies. Where those kings of Malabar who came and bent the knee to him, he actually gave gifts to their temples. So Jaya Jaitley, the politician, retired politician, she told me how in her grandfather, the Raja of Kolangod's palace, they have a plinth in their ancestral temple, which was given by Tipu Sultan because their ancestor bent the knee. But Tipu Sultan went and destroyed a number of other temples because those kings had got up and run away with their treasure instead of coming and paying homage to him. So every time someone says Tipu equal to villain, you can actually complicate it. You can actually say, when Vijayanagar fell, in 1565, there was a sensational battle between the sultans of the Deccan and Vijayanagar. And people always say, oh, this is an Islamic group killing and destroying this final Hindu empire. Again, you can complicate that for the simple reason that on the Vijayanagar side, there was a celebrated Muslim general called Ainul Mulk Gilani. On the side of the sultans, as I said, one of them was descended from a Brahmin, which was Nizam Shah of Ahmednagar. The Adil Shah of Bijapur at that battle was the adopted son of the Vijayanagar ruler. The Qutub Shah of Golconda at that battle had spent 7 years in Vijayanagar as a political exile and was very close to the Vijayanagar court till then. The Vijayanagar kings called themselves Hindu sultans. 6,000 Marathas fought at that battle, but they fought for the sultans, not for the Vijayanagar Hindu empire, as it were. So everything can be complicated, and that's the point of history. The point of historians is also to complicate. In terms of making it more accessible, social media helps to a certain extent, especially a platform. I find Instagram very useful because you don't have trolls and people coming and getting into these long arguments and petty debates. It works on images, and Indian history is full of images. We've got such rich visual history that Instagram is a great platform to popularize that. Other platforms like Twitter, etc., exist, but of course that gets very politicized, and before you know it, you're called either secular/secular or all kinds of names. So I don't really engage much on Twitter.
On those lines, a question from Oyan Chaudhary. Do you think that Indians have largely lost the sense of liberalism and plurality, excuse me, which it seemed it existed in the past? If so, what, in your opinion, is the key reason or reasons for this?
Earlier, information was not a commodity that came easily to people. So, although people, of course, there were networks of trade, there was movement and so on. The world, it took a while for news to travel. So people's identities were sort of constrained in local geographies. They were constrained in much smaller zones, and therefore their interests, etc., were also limited by that. What you find is as the 18th century progresses, as Enlightenment modernity happens, as the Industrial Revolution happens, communication becomes easier. Suddenly you have this whole crop of Westerners coming in, including the Orientalists, including these grumbling missionaries. Everybody's talking about, they're trying to define this culture. They're trying to define Hinduism. They're trying to define what Indian culture is. So they start picking out elements, and they start elevating some elements and diminishing some other elements. So that's why, for example, textual Sanskrit gets elevated as the source of Indian heritage, whereas anything oral with the tribes, with lower castes, is suddenly put aside as superstition. This has no value. And you create that politics. So new identities start forming. We often, when you do Indian history, Sanjay Subramanian, the historian, has this important thing about linking it to other patterns in the world, because we are almost naturally, because of our own, the way we've been raised or the context in which we've been raised, when I close my eyes and think Indian history, I've already got that map in my mind. But this map is only created in 1947. It was not the map that existed throughout the entire 2,000, 3,000 years we're talking about. So a lot of northeastern India had lots of closer relations to Burma. Kerala, where my ancestors come from, was culturally in greater contact with Arabia than it was with North India. It was difficult to get from Delhi to Kerala, but it was easier to get on a ship and go off to Arabia. In fact, Kerala's founding political legend has this king called Cheraman Perumal dividing his kingdom among his Hindu relations. And he witnesses the prophet splitting the moon, gets on a ship and goes off to Mecca to become a Muslim. That is Kerala's founding political legend, because already in that there is Arabia, and already in that there's Muslim, because that's how Kerala was exposed to the rest of the world. Tamil Nadu has its own culture, except that faced Southeast Asia. So in the 8th century, when the Pallava emperors of Kanchipuram ran out of India as we know it, in this current map, they realized that they had a long lost relation who went off to Cambodia and married a princess there. So Brahmins from Kanchipuram got on a boat, went to Cambodia, picked up a 12-year-old boy from there, brought him back to Kanchipuram and installed him as Nandivarman, the great Pallava emperor. So when people say, for example, the Mughals are foreigners because they came from outside India, well, does that mean all the Pallavas after Nandivarman are foreigners also because they came from Southeast Asia? These maps did not exist. These preconceived notions did not exist. As these identities were formed, as this whole concept of one standard homogenized Indian/Hindu identity was formed, that is when you start seeing politics also getting into this particular thing. Even then, I wouldn't say plurality is gone, because even now, when you go to the Sabarimala temple in Kerala, you have to first pay homage to a Muslim associate of the deity called Vavar, which is a corruption essentially of the word Babar. And that's a Muslim. You have to actually go to his mosque first. In my third book, The Courtesan, the Mahatma, and the Italian Brahman, there's the story of a Muslim princess, a Tughlaq princess, enshrined in two South Indian temples in Srirangam in Tamil Nadu and Melkote in Karnataka. In one place, she's enshrined as an idol, and she's an official consort. This Muslim woman is a consort of the deity. In another place, she's a wall painting. And there is a lot of overlap. There is, even now in our lived culture, there is a lot of pluralism. It's just that politics tends to dominate what we think is happening in our country. And we often think that when people vote for a certain party, they're sort of endorsing an ideology. That's not always the case. Sometimes I've seen it. I've also worked in politics briefly. And in that time, I've seen that often, it will be a local RSS worker who will take an old lady, fill in her form and help her get her old age pension. When she votes then for the RSS's affiliate, the BJP, she's not necessarily doing it because she believes in ideology. She will still celebrate her local festivals in Bengal. She will still retain a pluralist idea about her own society. She won't start shunning her Muslim neighbors, for example, even though she's voted for them, because there are various reasons why people vote, and it's not merely ideology. So we should always be aware that when an ideology dominates, it's not necessarily because it's become the new reality. Of course, ideologies can grow, it can become very dangerous, but equally there's no reason to become too pessimistic. I think Indian culture for several thousands of years has been pluralistic. It's not going to be easy to make it the reverse of that.
All right, the last question for today, it's along a slightly unexpected angle, but I'm sure you'll respond. Hasn't Bollywood shown interest in the fascinating Indian history that you have researched?
Actually, I wouldn't say Bollywood, but my first book, The Ivory Throne, has been optioned for a web series. Now, there are some talks for the second book on the Deccan also, because that, not a web series, but really that has good feature film potential. Because if you just forget for a moment the Mughals and the Marathas and look at that early 17th century period in Deccan history, at the same time, you have this Chand Bibi, a woman sultan who's fighting the Mughals, descended from Brahmins and Persians and with an African sister-in-law. At the same time, you have an Ibrahim Adil Shah with Persian and Maratha blood venerating Saraswati and Ganapati in Bijapur. At the same time, you have Shivaji's grandfather fighting with the African warlord Malikambar. And it's all happening in the same period. I think that's a great setting for a feature film. And the Mughals are starting to invade. Just imagine the drama that exists in that 25-year space in the first quarter of the 17th century. I think if that deal goes through, they may end up making a movie on that.
We'll all look forward to that. Thank you so very much. But I'll call upon my colleague on the library subcommittee, Professor Chaitali Mitru, to deliver officially the vote of thanks.
Thank you.
Chaitali.
Hello.
Yes.
Hello. Good evening, everybody. The chairman and the members of the library subcommittee of the Bengal Club join me in thanking Sri Manu Pillai profusely for this mesmerizing talk. It's been a privilege to hear him, his fresh insight about people who were part of history but went unnoticed and sometimes have been marginalized, come alive. They come alive with their human attributes, and they cut across many cultures, many canvases, giving rise to a sense not just of history but of historicity and meta-narratives. Thank you very much, Sri Manu Pillai, for this talk. Thanks also to the organizers, to Mr. Mukherjee for sort of organizing this event, and of course, all the participants. Thank you again.
Thank you very much. And I hope you all pick up the books as well.
We will. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Good evening and good night.